In the spring of 1943, inside a walled ghetto smaller than Central Park, a few hundred starving fighters armed with pistols, homemade grenades, and raw courage did something the Nazi war machine never expected. They fought back. For nearly a month, they held off tanks, artillery, and thousands of SS troops sent to erase them from history. This isn't just a story of defeat. It's the story of how the powerless chose dignity over silence. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this uprising unfolded, why it still matters today, and what these fighters can teach us about courage against impossible odds. This is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, pistols versus Panzers. When German forces marched into Warsaw in September 1939, the city's 350,000 Jews, nearly a third of its population, became targets of a campaign designed not just to conquer, but to erase. By November 1940, the Nazis sealed off a section of the city with a 10-foot wall topped with broken glass. Inside that wall, more than 400,000 people were crammed into just 1.3 square miles, an area you could walk across in 20 minutes, now forced to hold the population of a mid-sized city. Overcrowding meant 7 or 8 people sharing a single room. Food rations were set deliberately below survival level, as low as 180 calories a day for Jewish residents, compared to over 2,600 for Germans in the same city. Starvation became routine. Typhus spread through communal water pumps. Corpses, wrapped in newspaper, became a common sight on the sidewalks each morning, waiting for wagons to haul them away. Consider one family, the Lewins, a shoemaker, his wife, and 3 children, who sold their furniture piece by piece just to buy bread on the black market. By the winter of 1941, the father was dead of typhus. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the ghetto's daily arithmetic, repeated in thousands of households. And yet, the Nazis maintained a careful psychological trap. Propaganda posters promised resettlement and labor opportunities in the East. Rumors of mass murder were dismissed as exaggeration, even paranoia. Isolated from the outside world, cut off from reliable news, most residents clung to the fragile hope that survival meant compliance. That hope was about to be shattered. Because in the summer of 1942, the trains would start running, and what awaited at the other end of the tracks would change everything. On July 22, 1942, German authorities announced the start of what they called resettlement in the East. Ghetto residents were told to report voluntarily to the Umschlagplatz, the transfer point, in exchange for bread and jam. Thousands came willingly, desperate enough to believe that anywhere had to be better than the ghetto. They were wrong. The trains didn't lead to labor camps or new settlements. They led 60 miles northeast to an extermination camp called Treblinka, a facility built for one purpose only: mass murder on an industrial scale. Victims arrived, were stripped of belongings, and were dead within hours, most within minutes of arrival. Between July and September 1942, roughly 265,000 people were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto, nearly 2/3 of its remaining population, in less than 2 months. It remains one of the most concentrated mass-killing operations of the entire Holocaust. Not everyone was fooled for long. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian secretly documenting ghetto life for an archive he called Oneg Shabbat, began collecting testimonies from escapees and railway workers who described the gas chambers. Word filtered back through smuggled letters and whispered accounts from the few who managed to jump from moving trains. Among those piecing together the horrifying truth were young members of underground youth movements, Zionist, socialist, and communist alike, who had spent the ghetto years running secret schools and printing illegal newsletters. Now they faced a devastating recalibration. This wasn't resettlement. This was annihilation, delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. The psychological shift that followed was seismic. If deportation meant certain death regardless of behavior, obedience offered no protection. Compliance had bought nothing but time. A hardened resolve began to form among the ghetto's remaining 60,000 residents, mostly the young, the able-bodied, and those the Germans had deemed useful for slave labor, at least for now. One phrase began to circulate quietly among the surviving resistance-minded youth, whispered in basements and cellars. If we're going to die, we die fighting. That whispered resolve became an organization. In late 1942, survivors from various underground youth movements united to form the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, the Jewish combat organization known as JOB. Its members were staggeringly young, teenagers and 20-somethings who had never fired a weapon in their lives, thrust suddenly into roles as commanders and strategists. At the helm stood Mordecai Anielewicz, a 23-year-old former leader of a Zionist youth movement whose calm, methodical leadership would become legendary. Alongside him, Marek Edelman represented the Bund, a Jewish socialist party, bringing pragmatic organizational skill to the coalition. A second, separate group also emerged, the Żydowski Związek Wojskowy, or the Jewish Military Union, composed largely of revisionist Zionists and led by Pavel Frankel, with reported access to slightly better weaponry and military training. These groups didn't always agree ideologically. Socialists, communists, and right-wing nationalists rarely found common ground before the war. But annihilation has a way of dissolving old divisions. Necessity, not consensus, cemented their alliance. Underground infrastructure grew quickly and quietly. Fighters built hidden bunkers beneath buildings, dug tunnels connecting basements block by block, and established secret communication networks using couriers who moved through attics and cellars to avoid German patrols. They even created clandestine courts to try and, in extreme cases, execute suspected informants and Jewish police collaborators. A brutal necessity in an environment where a single betrayal could unravel the entire network. By early 1943, GOB commanded several hundred fighters organized into small cells, each responsible for a specific block or building. It was an army built from nothing. No formal training, no supply lines, no reinforcements, just conviction, improvisation, and the terrible clarity that came from knowing exactly what awaited them if they failed to act. What they lacked most desperately wasn't courage. It was weapons. Arming a resistance movement inside a sealed ghetto, surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire, bordered on the impossible. Yet Job and Joziobu fighters attempted exactly that, using every available channel to smuggle weapons past German checkpoints. The sewers became critical arteries, foul narrow tunnels running beneath the city that couriers used to move between the ghetto and the Aryan side of Warsaw. Sympathetic Poles and bribed guards occasionally looked the other way, allowing pistols, ammunition, and explosive materials to pass through gaps in the wall or hidden compartments in delivery carts. Contact with the Polish Home Army, the AK, produced mixed results. Some Polish resistance members provided weapons, training manuals, and even limited combat instruction, driven by genuine solidarity. Others were indifferent, or worse. Anti-Semitic elements within Polish society sometimes betrayed smuggling operations to German authorities. The relationship was fraught, inconsistent, and never fully reliable. What emerged from these efforts was, by any military standard, a pathetic arsenal, and yet, given the circumstances, a genuinely heroic one. Historians estimate Job possessed somewhere around 100 to 200 pistols, a handful of rifles, roughly one machine gun, and hundreds of homemade Molotov cocktails assembled from bottles filled with gasoline and rags. Grenades were crudely fashioned from scrap metal and stolen explosives. Ammunition was so scarce that fighters rationed bullets individually. Facing them stood a German garrison, equipped with tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, flamethrowers, and machine guns, backed by thousands of trained SS and police troops, along with Wehrmacht support units. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was the difference between a modern industrialized army and a handful of civilians clutching stolen sidearms. This was the collision the world would soon witness. Pistols against Panzers, desperation against engineering. And in January 1943, that collision would get its first startling preview. On January 18, 1943, German forces entered the ghetto to conduct what they assumed would be another routine deportation sweep, rounding up several thousand more Jews for transport to Treblinka. This time, something unprecedented happened. Job fighters, armed with their meager stockpile of pistols and grenades, ambushed the German columns from windows, doorways, and rooftops. The confrontation was brief, chaotic, and by conventional military standards, insignificant. But its psychological impact was massive. German troops, unprepared for armed resistance from a population they viewed as entirely subdued, retreated in confusion after sustaining unexpected casualties. The deportation action was cut short, ending after just a few days instead of the planned duration. Inside the ghetto, the effect was electric. For the first time since the occupation began, Jewish residents witnessed German soldiers retreating rather than advancing. It shattered the illusion of total powerlessness. Word spread rapidly through the remaining population. Resistance wasn't just an abstract idea whispered in bunkers. It was possible, and it worked, at least temporarily. Morale shifted dramatically. Volunteers for Job and Jawazidov increased. Residents began reinforcing bunkers with newfound urgency, understanding that the next German incursion would likely be the final one. On the German side, January's skirmish was dismissed as a minor irritant rather than a serious threat, a miscalculation that would prove costly. Commanders assumed the ghetto's remaining population posed no genuine military challenge. That assumption was about to be tested on a far larger scale. April 19, 1943, the eve of Passover, the Jewish festival commemorating liberation from slavery in Egypt. The irony was not lost on those who lived it. German forces, under the command of SS General Jürgen Stroop, entered the ghetto intending to complete its total liquidation within 3 days, deporting or killing every remaining resident. Waiting for them were roughly 750 Job and ZW fighters, dug into prepared positions across the ghetto's remaining blocks. As a German column advanced down Nalevki Street, fighters unleashed a coordinated ambush, pistols, grenades, and Molotov cocktails raining down from windows and rooftops. The column, expecting no resistance whatsoever, was forced into a chaotic retreat, leaving casualties in the street. It was a stunning opening blow. German tanks, brought in to intimidate and crush any pockets of defiance, became unexpected targets themselves. Fighters hurled Molotov cocktails from elevated positions, setting at least 2 tanks ablaze in the war's early hours. An almost unthinkable image. Teenagers with homemade firebombs disabling armored vehicles of the Third Reich. The ghetto's terrain became the resistance's greatest asset. Fighters used rooftop networks to move undetected between buildings, dropped through prepared holes in walls to escape encirclement, and vanished into sewer tunnels when German forces attempted to corner them. Every building became a potential ambush point. Every basement, a hidden bunker. For German command, the psychological impact was profound. This was supposed to be a 3-day mopping up operation against a starved, defenseless population. Instead, German forces were taking casualties, losing equipment, and encountering an enemy that refused to simply disappear. Stroop would later describe the fighting in terms of genuine surprise at the tenacity of the resistance. The 3-day timeline collapsed almost immediately. What followed would stretch into weeks of brutal block-by-block combat, a fight that German commanders never anticipated having to wage. Faced with unexpected resistance, Stroop abandoned hopes of a quick, clean operation and escalated dramatically. Artillery began systematically shelling ghetto buildings. Combat engineers moved through the streets, demolishing structures one at a time, denying fighters the cover they depended on. What couldn't be captured would be flattened. Job and GSW fighters adapted with brutal ingenuity. Unable to match German firepower directly, they relied entirely on hit-and-run tactics, striking from concealment, inflicting casualties, then vanishing before reinforcements arrived. Bunkers became fortified strongholds, some elaborately constructed with multiple entrances, ventilation systems, and stockpiled supplies designed to withstand extended sieges. Among the most significant strongholds was the bunker at Miła 18, which would eventually serve as Żob's central command post, housing over 100 fighters and civilians in cramped underground quarters. Anielewicz himself commanded from this location during the uprising's later, most desperate phase, coordinating remaining resistance cells as the ghetto around them collapsed into rubble. The human cost mounted relentlessly on both sides. German forces, despite overwhelming technological superiority, suffered steady casualties from ambushes and booby-trapped buildings. Jewish fighters and civilians faced far worse: starvation, smoke inhalation from burning buildings, and the ever-tightening noose of systematic demolition. The disproportion remained staggering throughout. German forces deployed tanks, artillery, flamethrowers, and thousands of trained troops against a few hundred fighters armed with pistols and improvised explosives. By any conventional military logic, the engagement should have concluded within days. Instead, it stretched into weeks. The explanation lies not in equipment, but in motivation. German soldiers fought as an occupying force completing an administrative task. Jewish fighters fought knowing that surrender meant certain death regardless, meaning every building became worth dying for, every bunker worth defending to the last bullet. That asymmetry of desperation, more than any tactical advantage, explains how pistols held Panzers at bay for as long as they did. By early May, unable to root out resistance fighters through conventional demolition alone, Stroop ordered a new strategy: burn the ghetto systematically, building by building, forcing fighters and civilians alike out of hiding through smoke and flame rather than direct assault. The results were catastrophic and effective. Entire blocks were reduced to smoldering ruins within days. Civilians hiding in basements and bunkers faced impossible choices: emerge into German custody or suffocate in the smoke-filled underground. On May 8th, German forces located the command bunker at Miła 18. Surrounded and with no realistic escape route, dozens of fighters and civilians inside chose mass suicide over capture, understanding that surrender meant torture and death regardless. Mordecai Anielewicz died in that bunker, along with much of Żob's remaining leadership, a devastating blow to the organized resistance. Marek Edelman, along with a small group of surviving fighters, managed what seemed impossible: escape through the sewer system, emerging on the Aryan side of Warsaw. With help from Polish resistance contacts, their survival preserved a direct, first-hand account of the uprising for future generations. On May 16, 1943, Stroop declared the operation complete. As a symbolic conclusion, he personally ordered the detonation of the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, reducing one of the city's most significant Jewish landmarks to rubble, a deliberate, theatrical assertion that the ghetto and its people no longer existed. By the numbers, it was unquestionably a German victory. Thousands of Jewish civilians and fighters were killed, and the ghetto itself ceased to exist as a physical space. But in refusing to go quietly, in forcing the most powerful military machine in Europe to fight street by street for nearly a month, the fighters had already secured something the Nazis couldn't erase: a symbolic triumph woven permanently into the historical record. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising didn't end resistance. It inspired it. Word of the fighting spread to other camps and ghettos, contributing directly to subsequent uprisings, including the August 1943 revolt at Treblinka itself, and the October 1943 uprising at Sobibor extermination camp, where prisoners used similarly improvised tactics to attempt mass escapes. Beyond its immediate influence, Warsaw became an enduring symbol of moral resistance against annihilation. In Israel, the uprising's anniversary is honored each year through Yom HaShoah, the Day of Holocaust Remembrance, explicitly linking national memory to the courage displayed within those ghetto walls. Memorials in Warsaw itself, including Nathan Rappaport's monument unveiled in 1948, ensure the story remains physically inscribed into the city's landscape. Marek Edelman, one of the uprising's few surviving commanders, spent decades afterward emphasizing a crucial distinction. The uprising was never about achieving military victory. It was about, in his words, preserving human dignity, choosing the manner of one's death when survival itself was no longer an option available to choose. That distinction carries a universal weight extending far beyond this specific historical moment. Resistance, in its truest form, isn't always measured by battles won or lives saved. Sometimes, its measure is simpler and more profound. The refusal to disappear silently, the insistence that oppression be met with defiance rather than passive acceptance, regardless of the odds. The fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto understood this completely. They knew, with near mathematical certainty, that they couldn't defeat the German war machine. They fought anyway, not because victory seemed possible, but because surrender without resistance felt unbearable. That choice remains their most lasting legacy. They knew they couldn't win. They fought anyway. Not for victory, for memory, for dignity, for the simple defiant act of choosing how their story would end. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising remains one of history's clearest proofs that courage doesn't require odds in your favor, only a refusal to disappear quietly. If this story moved you, subscribe, because history like this deserves to be remembered loudly.